Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you for joining us for the webinar where we have a very esteemed panelist to talk to you today about some interesting topics in the mobility space. And I request you to please use the QA functionality to post any questions you may have of the panelists today. So let's just go ahead and get started. My name is Shubha Kashyap. I'm the Director of Online Learning Design and Innovation here at the College of Engineering at Nexus. And I have been working with these two colleagues for our mobility credential here at Nexus. And so I want to give them a chance to each introduce themselves. They will be our featured panelists for today. So Peter, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. Peter Adriaens. I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering. I do have cross appointments at the Ross School of Business as well as in the School for Environment and Sustainability. I direct a Center for Smart Infrastructure Finance. And what that really means is sort of the next generation of financing of infrastructure. I mean, how do we actually use data to, to come up with more efficient financing and business models for infrastructure? My background is I am an engineer by training. I spent, as I said, about 15 years in the business school, mainly on the venture capital side. A couple of years ago, I had a chance to go to Finland for about 3 years and worked at the Research Institute of the Finnish economy. And the whole idea there was to design multi-asset investment funds to actually transition that economy into a green economy, focused on in three topical areas. One was mobility, the other one was energy, and the third one was green chemistries. And after I came back in 2016, we set up this center. And basically, what I'm going to be talking to you about today, as well as the lectures in the foundations course, is sort of a different, a non-traditional financial take on how we look at financing mobility infrastructure.
Thank you. And Peter, I'll mention this later as well, but I got a chance to listen to a few of your lectures yesterday and really enjoyed how you've internationalized the conversation. So thank you for your contribution here today. And Ian, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Ian Williams. I'm the fellow of the Law and Mobility Project program. The name goes back and forth, it seems like, depending on which website you're looking at the University of Michigan Law School, which is a partnership between the University of Michigan Law School, M-City, the AV testing facility at U of M, and the University of South Carolina School of Law. And what I do is study the legal and policy issues around new mobility technologies, emerging transportation technologies. So our initial focus was mostly on automated vehicles, and it continues to be a major focus of what we study, but also we study the law around things like e-scooters, drones, any sort of emerging transportation technology, and how the existing law might complement those new technologies, how laws might need to be changed. And we publish a law journal, the Journal of Law and Mobility, which is all online, and which it's unique among law journals because it's run by me as a staff member alongside an editorial team of experts, engineers, and lawyers from around the world. Traditional law journals are run by law students, and I ran a technology law journal here at Michigan as a law student. But our journal adds a new level of expertise by having more of a peer review process to really try to build this discussion. Since these technologies are new and the legal and policy ramifications around them are rather new, it really helps to have a really fantastic team of experts working with us.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. So for those participants that have joined us online today, I can provide a little context for our conversations, is that you may have heard that the University of Michigan's College of Engineering unit known as Nexus has launched a mobility credential in the online space. The second course is launching in January 2021. And this course is an intersection or cross-section of variety of topics. It's very interdisciplinary in nature. It's 100% online. And the first course, which ran this fall and will run again, is related to behavior and technology and how that intersects in the mobility space. The second course, of which Peter and Ian are faculty in, are really designed around the systems designs, the finance, and the regulatory environment that mobility impacts or is impacted by. And it is a self-paced course, 100% online. And one of the really the value adds and the features of this is the intersectionality of the topics around mobility and the faculty that come from across the university and across disciplines to provide information to show how mobility is so interdisciplinary in nature. And so you'll hear us referencing various modules and topics. It's because Ian and Peter each lead substantive topics in these areas. And that's what we're going to spend our time talking about today. And if you would like more information about the program overall, feel free to join the website that's listed there. Today, we're really going to focus on the finance and regulatory environments. So with that, I think we'll just kick off. I do have some questions that people have raised since we've been working together in this space for about a year now, over a year. And I just love to give people an introduction to the topic in the space. So with that, Peter, maybe you and I can chat first. So could you tell us a little bit about your topic overall and the space and mobility, the topics of mobility that you really focus on?
Yeah, so as you will notice, my approach to financing transportation and mobility is a little bit of a different take from sort of the traditional financing models, I guess, that people deploy in the infrastructure or transportation and mobility infrastructure space. Because it sort of starts with the first question, right? And that is, what is transportation and mobility? So when I get the question posed, well, how do you finance transportation and mobility? And my first question back is, what do you mean? Because that lens on what is transportation and mobility really depends on the discipline where you come from or the experience, I guess, that you want to try to get financed, right? So it includes anything from the hard assets, such as, the roads and the bridges and the sensor infrastructure, to the multimodality, such as anything from connected vehicles to scooters to mass transit and whatnot, to then the whole software platforms that go along with it. And on top of that, because we're going more and more towards autonomous and we're going more and more towards connected vehicles and whatnot, now we're talking about another piece of infrastructure, and that is the whole digital infrastructure, the information and communications infrastructure. And all these different pieces of transportation and mobility actually all have very different characteristics from an investment perspective. And I tend to take the lens on the private side, in part because the private sector increasingly is getting connected with the public sector through public-private partnerships to actually make these things work, right? And so when you look at all these different assets that are part of the components that are part of transportation and mobility, we really have to think about what are all the different risk and return frameworks, I guess, that people explore or look at when you try to finance infrastructure systems. And some of it was informed actually by my work in Finland. Finland, much like many of the Nordics, as well as Estonia and whatnot, are very digital economies and very digitized economies. And one of the things that they have done is to really sort of start rethinking how they finance transformational change in their economies, right? It's not about picking winners or losers, like, okay, we're going to do connected or autonomous or drones, or there was nothing or. It was basically, how do you do it systematically? How do you leverage existing resources that are already on the ground that you've had for decades in your country or in your counties or whatnot, and how do you build on that to actually, affect that transformation? And those are very challenging concepts to think about when you say, how do we finance that? Because we've been sort of so used for 100 years, pretty much since about 1817, I guess, to get things financed through the public sector, and that's a long time. So I mean, increasingly, as we know, there are not enough resources available in the public sector to actually finance all these transformations, all these changes, all these upgrades, all these needs for resiliency and innovation. And as Ian just remarked, as more and more technology is brought into all these changes, I guess, in transportation and mobility, these old models really don't work anymore. These old funding models don't work. And we really have to start thinking about sort of innovations on the financing side as well. So just in closure, as we talk about transformation, I guess, or innovations in mobility and transportation, we have to concurrently also look at the innovations in business models and finance, because both of them go hand in hand. You can't change one without the other. And that's sort of my perspective on this whole financing area.
Yeah, Peter, that was a really, it seems so obvious, right? You have an innovation and you think about how you're going to pay for it. Some people focus on the engineering and the technology. Some people focus on the money. But what I really liked about your module is that it's really what you can't do one and then the other. It's not a linear process. It's based on how the whole system works and how far you're willing to go to rethink that. So I really liked how you integrated that throughout the conversation, because I think that's the nature of how the finance and funding spaces are changing.
Right.
Thank you. So can we talk a little bit about finance and funding? Because I think that was a really important perspective, and something that, whether you're in the mobility space or not, it's an interesting concept to start thinking about for whatever context you may find yourself. Can you talk a little bit about the finance versus funding conversation?
Yeah, financing and funding very often sort of get mixed up in the media, as well as in sort of the public conversations and whatnot. And sort of at the most simplistic levels. So funding is money that you don't need to pay back, and financing is money that you do need to pay back. So there's that's a sort of a very kind of fundamental difference, right? So when we need both funding and financing in order to move any kind of new infrastructure, any kind of new innovations forward, right? So the financing is the kind of monies that you go seek on either on the financial markets through bonds or private equity or loans, bank loans or whatnot that all charge, say, an interest or have an expectation on a return, because any money that is plunked into any kind of innovation takes a risk, right? And so these risks are sort of rewarded by a return, be it an interest, be it an internal rate of return, or some other way, I guess, how it needs to be repaid. So anything that needs to be repaid, money that you go find on the capital markets, is a financing instrument. Now, the funding is the money that you will generate through your transportation and mobility system to actually pay these financing costs, right? So for example, taxes are one way to pay a financing cost. User fees are a way to pay a financing cost. Parking fees, are a way to pay a financing cost. So you always have to think about the funding is the money that you generate through your project, whatever that project is, to pay the cost of the financing of the money that you try to attract out of the markets to, build this piece of infrastructure to begin with. And so, and that's where it's almost like, think about, your elementary school. Actually, it's not even elementary school. It's probably your preschool, right? Preschool game, you have to sort of match things up, right? So which color on the left side matches the color on the right side, or which shape on the left matches the shape on the right side. And what we need to do in funding and financing is figuring out what kind of funding mechanism sort of matches up with what kind of financing mechanism. And it's obviously not as easy as elementary school, but there's sort of whole models in between and how we try to connect these dots. So when I read in the newspapers, city X is going to fund this, whatever is going to fund let's say a new smart corridor. So my initial reaction is, no, they're not. they're financing it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they may have figured out how they're going to fund it, but they're going to need to actually raise money elsewhere, attract it elsewhere from the federal government, from banks, from the capital markets to actually build that project to begin with. And so
Mm-hmm.
these are sort of, and it might seem trite, but it's actually quite important to make that distinction. In particularly, sort of back to my earlier and to your earlier question, Shubha, on how I think about infrastructure, right? I mean, you have these real assets like roads and bridges, and they have regulated infrastructure such as all your charging systems and your telecoms infrastructure that you might need for connected vehicles. And then you have sort of the multimodality and the software. I mean, these 3 or 4 categories are all financed differently. Therefore, the funding that you need for each of these is going to be different as well. And
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of the, again, it might seem sort of very academic, but in reality, it really isn't. I mean, the financial models that anybody needs to come up with to, whether it's to structure the Gordie Howe Bridge or whether it is to, repave I-275, or whether it is to fund an access road to the airport, you really have to think, what is it really what you need, which kind of assets are you going to put in place, and then therefore what kind of financing do you need and how are you going to pay for that financing. It's always
Mm-hmm.
the same question. So that's where practitioners need to sort of discuss and figure out and test.
Yeah, and I think that because the mobility conversations are changing the landscape, roads don't necessarily mean the same thing if the cars are autonomous,
Right.
or if the airspace is changing. And we've been preparing for the airspace to change for a while, but what does that mean for the infrastructure and how it's funded? And that's why I really enjoyed this module, because it actually forced me to think about the infrastructure that I thought I understood, to think about it for the mobility space of the future, and then how people will stake their claim in terms of the financing and funding. So the infrastructure changes means the money flows in different ways too. Thank
Right.
you for that. So we do have oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so even just to add to that, because what I didn't mention earlier is we're going all digital, right? I mean, as you mentioned, Shubia, we're dealing more. I mean, people start thinking differently about infrastructure, given that, as you said, a road versus a connected road are really 2 very different pieces of infrastructure. And the big difference is data, right? Now, data don't have their own lanes, right? As we would say. I mean, so there is a silo for a hard asset and for software and for say a multimodality, but data flow horizontally through all of them, right? So if you say we're to set up a connected road, well, who owns and who can monetize the data that are necessary to connect a car or an autonomous shuttle or anything else with the actual infrastructure, as in the road, the road that becomes a smart road because of whatever sensors embedded in the infrastructure. Is it the
Mm-hmm.
state? Is that actually really a public asset? Is it the automotive companies? Is it going to be the telecoms companies, or is it you and me, because we're the drivers and we're actually contributing the data to the system? So who actually is the owner, or the who has the rights to monetize the data that flow across these next generation infrastructure systems? And these are questions that are not only technically and financially important, but of course regulatory have, and then Ian's going to be talking about that, have major implications from a privacy and cybersecurity and all these other issues perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. As you were mentioning this, I thought, the first thing I'd want to do is read the fine print, aka call my lawyer or check the regulatory environment, see what
Right.
the local or municipal plans are. And so that, of course, takes me to you, Ian, is thank you for joining us today, because finance and regulatory environments go hand in hand, in my opinion. They are not something that we can separate. So can you talk a little bit about your module and how your topic relates to the mobility space, but also the contributions that you bring that relate to this finance and regulatory environment.
Yeah, so my module covers a large amount of information, but looking at how transportation and mobility are governed right now, which is at the state, local, and federal levels. So just as an example, like to understand how these new technologies are going to play on the streets and in our transportation system, you have to understand how transportation is currently regulated. And just as example, for like one car, so you own a car in Ann Arbor. The city of Ann Arbor might have set rules about, and does set rules obviously, about parking. They will charge you for parking. They'll say when and where you can park. They'll enforce traffic laws. They'll do things like that. They're also maintaining the city streets and repairing them and making changes to them, upgrading them as necessary. Then you have, like, above the local level, you might have county governments that control and own some assets and streets and maintain them. Those could be there could be streets that have county and state governments cooperating to repair them and maintain them. And then at the federal level, you have the federal government doing a lot more, providing money, providing research. So sorry, I skipped the state. The state government, if you have that car that's sitting on the street in Ann Arbor, the state government is what's issued its license plates, it's what issued the title. State government is in charge of making sure who owns a vehicle and is the vehicle is the vehicle in the right shape to be on the road, and making sure it's always registered and insured. And they're not only making sure that the person has insurance, they're also regulating the insurance company and deciding what kind of coverage a person needs to have if they want to own and operate a vehicle. And then at the federal level, with a unique vehicle, each unique vehicle, federal government is regulating the safety of those vehicles. So every component and piece of your car has a safety standard set by the federal government that the automakers have to meet before they can release that vehicle to the public and have it operate on the streets. So that system exists, and then the same system exists of departments of transportation from a city level all the way through county departments of transportation, state departments of transportation, and the United States Department of Transportation that are regulating all the forms of transportation, not just the street, but also air travel, also drones, also anything and everything. But they're setting rules, and they're usually, either setting their own rules and regulations or enforcing or operating under the laws passed by legislatures and city governments and the federal government, which are maintaining the system, but also deciding what is it. So a good example with emerging technology, automated vehicles. At the local level, cities and towns have started to make deals with autonomous vehicle companies to try to bring vehicles onto their streets and allow them to operate. But at the same time, before you can do that, often you have to go to the state government and have the laws changed to allow autonomous vehicles to be on the road. Legally, there's always a definition of what is a driver, and it's usually it'll say the person that operates a vehicle or something to that effect. But when a machine is operating the car, you've suddenly changed you've taken the person out of that, and you have to rewrite the law to change that definition and either say that the driver is the automated system that's operating the vehicle, or the driver, for legal responsibility reasons, is the person that owned the car, or even the automaker that produced the car and designed the self-driving system. So you have to kind of introduce these new technologies into the law. And the same is true with things like e-scooters, where they because they're powered vehicles, they might not fall into the same legal definition as a bicycle, depending on the state. And so that means they might not be able to operate on the sidewalk or operate on the street or operate at all. Every city every state and sometimes cities have different definitions of vehicles. And so it becomes a real muddle of, when you're starting to introduce these new technologies, you have to look at multiple levels of governance, figure out where's the definition currently. Do we need to go talk to somebody about changing that definition? And where those changes come from sometimes is it's definitely from automakers and companies advocating for those changes, but lawmakers themselves are pushing for it because they want these technologies in their cities. Citizens and communities might push for them because they want these technologies to improve their transportation, their access. So you have to play a game at multiple levels whenever you try to bring even one new technology onto the street.
Yeah. So this is interesting too, because this is, when we talk about mobility in this credential, in this online program, we are talking about the movement of people, goods, and services. And so that is really a cross section. If we think about mobility as getting in your car and going somewhere, you may think about the Department of Transportation or some of the other regulatory organizations that you mentioned. We're talking about goods. Now we may even be talking about an even larger or a different part of the regulatory environment. And then services brings up a whole nother aspect of mobility. And I think that's being redefined right now with across the board. And I think that situations like the pandemic changes what movement of services looks like. So one of the things that Peter had mentioned was, how data is impacted or is impacting the conversation. Can you talk a little, and then the whole aspect of cybersecurity, which is another area where Nexus has programming. Can you talk a little bit about the data aspects? Now, that's a very big topic. I realize that I'm feeding you a huge topic, but I think that what participants have asked about is, where do you begin? When there's a conversation like data, which is such a daunting, large task, and in a regulatory environment, what's a good sort of first step to look at? And I just want to mention for other participants, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A for Ian or Peter or anyone else here that can help out. So Ian, thoughts on data, and where do we begin with the regulatory environment?
I mean, it is a huge question. And I mean, Peter already touched on why it's a huge question in some parts, because the value of this data is tremendous. A massive data economy that we're building, and things like an automated vehicle could generate up to like a terabyte of data an hour because of all the different sensors that are involved in its operation. And every type of transportation is collecting data. One thing from a regulatory standpoint is to think about what is this data being used and who's looking for it. So there are governments that are looking for this data for to improve the transportation systems. Departments of transportation want to have access to the data that's being generated by vehicles. I mean, they already have their own sensors and data points, but they want access to the data that's being generated by private companies. And you have some places like Los Angeles has what's called the mobility data specification, where they've kind of set down some rules and structures to try to create a common language between not only the government-owned and operated systems, but also a common language with people like Uber and Lyft and the e-scooter companies and bike share companies. So that way, the city government, as it's doing its transportation planning, can have a better view of, hey, this is how many bikes are out in the street right now, and the changes in demand on bikes or e-scooters given the day. This is how many ride shares are on the street, and changes in demand there, traffic flow patterns. And then they can combine that with the things they already know about mass transit or their own traffic data, and that can really improve planning. So that's a huge thing. And I think most people would be probably comfortable with that kind of data usage because it's improving people's lives. It's very typical for what the government does, But then you think about, how are the companies that are collecting this data and what are they doing elsewhere with it? And a lot of that is where they're making money by selling your data to third parties. Right now, there's no federal law that bans that or changes that relationship. Like once you've started handing over your data to another company, unless you have some sort of really tight signed agreement between you and the company, which is not the case for consumers usually, then your data can be sold off and traded like any other commodity. There are laws like California has a Consumer Privacy Act, but that only deals with the sales to third parties. So for example, if you have a car in a connected vehicle and you're driving it in California, you own it in California, the car company, the automaker, still has the right to collect data from your usage and use that for their own internal purposes. It becomes nebulous, or they might be barred from selling it to another party, but they're still going to be able to use it. So even when you have some privacy laws come into effect, they don't always change things that much, or they limit the market, but they don't change that. Like a third party is still going to have a lot of data about your life. And I mean, this is like location data about your daily movements, which it's not hard to predict someone's behavior day to day to day once you have a small amount, even a small amount of data about how they move around the world. So that's the biggest privacy question. And then there's the third question of, I mean, cybersecurity is how you keep all of this safe. There was just recently a law passed by Congress on the Internet of Things, which is all the various connected devices we have in the world, which was the federal government's going to start setting better standards, or newer standards for the cybersecurity of any and all connected devices, and cars are going to have to be included in that because of the way, and all transportation technology, because of the way how interconnected it's going to be. But that's a ways that just passed, so it's going to take time for them to write those standards. But you also have to question what the government knows about you and the cybersecurity, not only protecting your vehicle from malicious hackers who want to mess with it, or transportation system, but also what the government knows from a law enforcement standpoint, kind of like what surveillance is possible. And right now, cars are like a kind of a liminal weird space in that kind of law, where the police have a lot more ability to search your car without a warrant than they have to search your home. But that's slowly changing because there are more and more rulings coming down from the Supreme Court and from state Supreme Courts saying, you have to have a warrant to search someone's cell phone. And so can that be extended? There was even one in Georgia that was, you have to have a warrant to search the data on someone's car. So will that keep getting extended? Will the data that is being generated be protected from government oversight? That's another question. The one other thing I'd noticed with cybersecurity is how can you get the control over your data, not only when it leaves your car, but the control over your data when it's on your car, is something I think is worth exploring and isn't regulated very well, but comes up in law enforcement a lot. So like there was a case in 2018 where the ATF arrested a accused drug dealer, and this guy had thought he'd wiped all the data off of his car entertainment system because he'd synced his phone to the car, and the ATF was able to pull passwords, phone call records, and other like biometrics and stuff and GPS history that had been on his phone, but had leaked from his phone because his phone is connected to his car. It leaked between them, and the police were able to pull that off. And obviously most people think it's a criminal case. Most people will say, I'm not going to be arrested by the police for something like that, so why should I care? But also there's a huge market for used vehicles in general. So if your private data is being synced, is slowly leaking onto your car, even small amounts of it, and even when you think you've erased it, it's still there, that's a huge cybersecurity and privacy issue. And through regulation, you could try to encourage automakers to make it easier to erase that kind of data. But it's something to think about, especially if you have a car and you're selling it off when you get rid of your car.
Yeah, well, you just gave me one more thing to worry about, Ian. Hadn't thought about that till today's conversation.
Don't take it when you rent a car.
Yeah, no, rental car, exact same thing. Yeah, great. Like if you sync your cell phone to a rental car, be really careful. I mean,
yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And I suspect that when I click on those, sure, I agree apps, or sign a long document to take out that rental car, I just gave a little bit of autonomy on my data up. And Peter, I suspect that was a pretty big bargaining chip in the finance side of how some of those conversations are built up, is who gets to control some of the data that gets gathered in the finance and funding space.
Yeah, obviously. Actually, going back to these agreements, a couple of years ago, I had an M-Cube, right? That's one of these sort of joint collaborative research collaborative agreements at the University of Michigan, where you work with professors at other disciplines. And there was a master's student who was working on his thesis on that, and his entire job was to actually read all of these data agreements to actually figure out what the fine print was. I mean, it's all the blah blah stuff, right? You have to sort of tease out what actually these companies are disclosing, what they're doing with that data. But yeah, in terms of the data space is, and the business to business data agreements are becoming a huge part. And it's not just in the transportation and mobility, it's pretty much, in any digitization of the economy, right? I mean, just even go back to the basics, right, of Uber. Everybody has taken an Uber, right? So basically, during the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, but during the I mean, from the time that you order your car until about an hour after you leave the car, the data that you transmit, however you use your phone and whatnot, are in custodianship of Uber. So basically, during that time, those data from all the millions of others of people are being processed, repackaged, kind of packaged like mortgages. Think of it that way, right? And then you repackage it again, you repackage it again, you extract all sorts of features and attributes, and it gets sold on data markets, right? And so, I mean, in some markets, I mean, companies like an Uber, I mean, they make 3 times as much money off of the data as they make off of the actual ride. I
Mhm.
wouldn't say that that's in Michigan, but in some markets, I mean, that is the case. So I mean, data has become an incredibly big part of financing. But I should also caution that the data aren't only about your private data and private issues, right? So infrastructure, I mean, infrastructure projects are massive billion-dollar projects with lots of data being collected also on structural health, right? So you have DOT trucks driving around and whatnot, and actually they detect, how many cracks per linear mile and all of those kind of things on roads. There is embedded sensors in roads,
Mhm.
way in motion sensors, right? I mean, many of you are familiar with in the olden days, right? I mean, the trucks would sort of, get off the road and go into these way stations. And I would ask anybody who's on this webinar the next time you drive on the road, how many trucks you actually see on way stations. I don't mean on truck stops, and still truck stops, but in way stations, how many trucks you see. And I'll tell you, you will not see many trucks. And one of the reasons why you don't see many trucks is because most of the roads have now become equipped with sort of strips of way in motion sensors, such that uh, um, the road can actually, the sensor can distinguish between a sedan and an 18 wheeler, and it can also figure out whether the 18 wheeler is loaded or not loaded, right? So it is automatically sort of
Mhm.
being registered and recorded on, at least particularly on federal roads and whatnot. And one of the reasons why it's done, not the only reason, one of the reasons why it's done is, well, I mean, how are federal roads and bridges being kept up? Where does that money come from? Most of that comes from the Federal Highway Trust Fund, right? So where does the money from the Federal Highway Trust Fund come from? It comes from your gas taxes, federal gas taxes. How does the Federal Highway Trust Fund know how to reallocate that money that's in the central pocket now back to the individual states from where the federal gas taxes were collected? Most of that is based on truck miles driven in that particular state. How do you know truck miles driven in that particular state? Way in motion sensors. There you go. I mean, you got the entire system all packaged. So there is that link between the sensor in your gas, well, not yours, but well, yeah, actually your federal gas taxes as well. Federal gas taxes per state, way in motion sensors in roads, Federal Highway Trust Fund, reallocation back to states based on the truck miles driven. So clearly it is a central core part of how our infrastructure functions, right?
Mhm.
And more, as Ian was pointing out, with all the data now that we're collecting, both private data as well as infrastructure data, all that can get in similar ways repackaged either by private entities or by public entities, public agencies, and figuring out how to monetize that or trade that. I mean, in fact, again, back to Finland. I mean, Finland is together with, I mean, also Stockholm and London and whatnot, definitely on the forefront of a lot of this, both public and private data issue, in that I mean, the question becomes, I mean, how do we actually manage it? How do we govern that, right? It's a governance problem. And so in order to give the citizen trust that the data are not being abused and misused. And so one of the proposals is maybe we need to set up data trusts within a city. And some cities are doing that. Now the question is, who's going to govern data trusts? Well, these are data commissioners, elected data commissioners. Think about your drain commissioners. It's not the same thing, but this would be an elected data commissioner or a committee of data commissioners that oversees the kind of covenants and restrictions that you write in the contract, the data contracts that get traded between all the different parties. I mean, ultimately, there
Mhm.
has to be, and Ian pointed out right now, there is no federal law I guess. And I don't know enough about that. I'll defer to him on that one. There is no federal law that governs that. But cities are sort of, because of the concerns from citizens, in a way taking, the initiative in their own hands and say, well, maybe we should set up a data trust. It's data
Mm-hmm.
for the public good. How do we use data for the public good? How do we set up data contracts with the private sector such that the private sector can build a service on the public infrastructure? And so what do we disclose? What can they use and whatnot? It's as much a legal question as it is a financial question, because depending on what you can do with it, it depends then, or based on what you can do with it, you generate different kind of monetization strategies around
Mm-hmm.
that. Right? So it's a
Mm-hmm.
absolutely fascinating field.
It is. What I really liked about this credential overall, but this course specifically and your modules is that someone like myself, who does not have an engineering background, but is directly impacted by the decisions made, the regulatory environment, how these things are set up as a consumer. The course opened my eyes to how I am impacted by the choices being made or discussions being had by my representatives, by the companies I work with, or the products I consume. And it really gave me that core foundational knowledge to get enough information that I could actually understand that there was a whole topic there to be covered. Each one of these modules could be a course in and of itself, but what it did was it gave me quick snapshots and foundational knowledge to be able to speak to, at least acknowledge that there's a whole large part of mobility in the regulatory space, a large part of the conversation around financing, which if you have background in, building vehicles or, mechanical engineering or otherwise, you may not have necessarily thought about the financing, the regulatory environment, right? And so as someone who didn't have a background in that, your modules gave me, in some ways, first exposure to the topic. And then it really forced me to think about, what does this do for the space I work in? Or how are my customers, my clients, my students, my parents, my family, anyone impacted by this? So we have a question that's come in, and I'd like to jump to it, is that is people that may not have a finance background, but maybe work in the climate spaces or want to understand risk impact regarding mobility infrastructure. So the question is, as infrastructure is damaged, whether it's due climate, due to the changing, I'll just call them vehicles on the space. I don't know that that's even the word that we should be using them anymore, but as infrastructure is damaged or is expected to increase in, damage is supposed to increase, or just the changes to the infrastructure, is there insurance or safeguards being built into financing models? And I would add into the regulatory models, the legal environments. What do those safeguards look like? Is that something that we're building into structure in anticipation of damage or change? Is that a conversation that's happening now? And what does that look like? And Peter, I'll start with you.
Let me try to at least poke a little bit around that question. Every infrastructure system is designed with a certain lifetime and a certain O&M, operations and maintenance expectation and upkeep expectation. I mean, in fact, one of the reasons why we sort of went into public-private partnerships, or one of the impacts of going into public-private partnerships, was to separate out the construction of the infrastructure with the operations and the maintenance of the infrastructure, as sort of being looking at two separate entities of the same thing. And so now you have these lifetime expectations, you have impacts from climate, you have impacts from trucks, you have impacts from everything else is actually built in. I mean, within a P3, for example, I mean, we could talk about insurance in a second, but within the context here of a public-private partnership, right? So where the state pays operational fixed fees, we call them availability payments, say to an operator of a road. Say you have a construction company and an operator that manages I-275. I'm just making something up, right? So it's actually not even made up. It's a true example of a P3, right? So there are in the contracts, in the public-private partnership, there is within the contracts, there are specifications written into that the roads have to be, for example, maintained to have fewer than X cracks per linear mile. I mean, down to that level of detail. So basically now there is an expectation, and basically the payment from the state to the operator of the asset only will happen or get triggered if that expectation is met, right? So those, I mean, that's sort of one example of call it
Mm-hmm.
call it insurance. It's not really insurance, but it's at least an insurance that the operator is actually maintaining the asset to certain levels of specifications. Now, again, not all assets have separate operators that actually maintain these assets. Sometimes it's the state itself. And the challenge with the state itself is that the state insures itself. Um, and I mean, I don't want to go into that because we had concrete falling off bridges and whatnot, I guess, for back in the day. So the
Mm-hmm.
upkeep is actually done by the state and not by a third party operator that has to meet certain specifications. So, but that's really one of the big drivers why we started separating out building the asset, operating the asset. In the
Mm-hmm.
context of say for example truck impacts on roads, right? Because I mean it's the 18 wheelers that impact the road decks and the bridge decks and the cracks a lot more than, for example, sedans, right? We don't even talk about the climate change and all of those issues. But what some states are starting to figure out, and actually we're working on that as well at the University of Michigan, is using load sensors and stress sensors on roads and bridges. We can actually, and knowing something about the kind of traffic that drives, I mean, units of cars, units of trucks that drive, volume of trucks that drive per unit time on these roads, around these bridges, we can actually come up with an estimate of what the impact is of truck traffic on reduced life expectations of a road deck, for example. Now,
Mm-hmm.
one can actually quantify that because there is in finance and economics, of course, you calculate your lifetime expectations and you discount the value of that road then over time, whether it lasts 20 years or when it lasts 15 years. So there is a
Mm-hmm.
difference between say 15 years and 20 years. Now I mean in Illinois and in New Jersey, and actually as I said, we're starting to think about that. People are trying to figure out a way on how we can recuperate some of the reduced lifetime expectations of a road or a bridge and charge it back to the logistics companies that
Mm-hmm.
operate the trucks, right? So it becomes very interesting as we're back to your to our audience question. Yes, there it is. Some of it is built in P3s, but in other cases, I mean, we're starting to use data to actually get a better understanding of what actually drives that deterioration of
Mm-hmm.
that road, of that bridge, of that a toll road going down or whatnot, and how you actually then deal with that. Now, everything that is financed privately, because, and I know we're going to talk later about P3s a lot more, because there's many different kinds of public-private partnerships, but
Mm-hmm.
see, public-private partnerships where the private sector brings money to the table as well. They actually insure and have risk transfer mechanisms set up around their financing models. As I said,
Mm-hmm.
the public agencies, the state self-insures, the private sector has, sort of additional insurance models that are built on top of their of their
Mm-hmm.
of their own capital investment.
Yeah,
But
I can imagine with all the data out there that I will maybe not yet, but I could probably, or somebody could probably start calculating the cost of the infrastructure of my 2-day Prime Amazon package. And I might start seeing a fee on that. Who knows? The impact to the climate or you know, that's the type of, data that we might be collecting today. We might not be talking about it, but I think that's the type of conversation and how that impacts the climate, how it impacts the roads. I think that's a large supply chain conversation as well. Ian, can you talk a little bit about the safeguards that are being discussed or we are seeing in the regulatory environment for some of the choices that we're seeing for our infrastructure or roads or the mobility space overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think in environmental protection wise, it's a hard discussion to have because the governments are kind of split on how much we should be working on environmental protection across the country and at the federal level. But you can do things as close as specific as deciding what type of concrete you're using to build a highway, which is a decision made at the state level usually. The different states use different mixes and they behave differently in weather conditions. And that's one reason I've been told for why Michigan's roads are famously bad is the mix of concrete is different than they use in other states. And it doesn't react as well to the weather that Michigan has. But like, that's the thing where at the state level, you can make decisions about the materials you're using at the state level or at the local level when you're building new roads or redesigning existing roads. You can try to take into account the floodplains and the environmental conditions on the ground now versus how they might be changing. And that's an interesting discussion. It's actually not something I touched on in my module, but I think is really fascinating is what do we do? How do we adapt our existing transportation system as we're rebuilding highways or building new highways to meet the climate change demands? And you see things like in the Florida Keys, some small islands where they're getting more and more flooded every year. And the county government or even the state government is starting to pull back and trying to decide, is it even worth, yet there's only, say 50 people that live on this island. Is it worth maintaining this road when we know the cost of raising it up above the floodplain or the cost of, creating a new drainage system is so great that it goes beyond what we should spend on a small amount of people who live on one island. And that's going to be that kind of question is going to have to be asked across the world, and especially across the country, in low-lying areas, in places where there are floodplains, in places where the climate change is really going to threaten existing infrastructure. And so some of it's regulatory of new design standards, regulatory of changing design standards, and some of it is a real discussion of, if we let people build in floodplains, we let people build highways in floodplains, do we then, how much are we willing to give public resources to bail them out when it floods again? When we know kind of the future to come, possibly.
Potential impacts in the long run. Yeah, I was thinking too that, yes, please, go ahead.
I'd like to add to that, because actually you brought up a very interesting point and a very important point, and that is this whole inequality, right? I mean, so this whole question around, as I said, the island, there's not enough people living on that. Are we going to even upkeep or sort of upkeep their infrastructure, or kind of leave them behind, right? As a result of climate change or other kind of needs for upgrades. And so this is a discussion I've been having with state officials, as well as is something that's being discussed at conferences, that, if you think about where most of the money for infrastructure upgrades goes in Michigan, I don't think people have to think too long where it goes. It's Southeast Michigan, Southwest Michigan, right? It's essentially the economic centers, and the bulk of it's Southeast Michigan, because that's where sort of a lot of economic activity is. It is actually very counterintuitive, because particularly in the data economy, because it's Southeast Michigan where the economic centers and economic activity is, where now through data monetization and other kind of mechanisms, actually these environments can actually start sustaining some of their own infrastructure, such that the state can actually start redirecting some of their capital to rural areas. So these are conversations that we have now. Of course, in the current model, the current allocation model, it is driven by where most of the traffic, most of the economic activity, most of the people live. And so everybody else, you're in the upper part of the lower peninsula or wherever, and you say, like, we have to let our bridges go, right? And we have to let our infrastructure go. So I said, no, you have to really rethink that, because these new monetization models, these new smart asset management models, or smart infrastructure models, actually will allow you to recapture value for your infrastructure in Southeast Michigan, such that the state can actually sort of in a lopsided way subsidize the other areas and keep bringing them and
right
in the economy.
Yeah, it allows for some flexibility and reallocation based on sort of other freed up resources then, or revenue generated opportunities in some ways. So the piece that I wanted to mention for our participants, who thank you for posting your questions, is that one of the features, as you can see, we have faculty in the program who are right in the thick of it, right? They are speaking at conferences, they are working in the regulatory environment, they are working with government officials, and you'll find that across the board with the credentials. You'll interact anywhere between 5, depending on how many of the courses you take, 5 to 6 faculty per course, and they are all in the prime location of spaces to talk about these very relevant topics to the mobility space. And you may notice that mobility is now impacting conversations in several disciplines. One of the key features of this program is that with every module, there is an open conversation space where the faculty get online and they're there to interact with you. They're to talk about any questions you may have. And it's really an open space for you to pick their brains and have conversations. And for those that attend, that's actually one of their favorite parts about this credential and this experience is if you have special interest in specific topics, the faculty are there. You can speak to them directly and talk to them about what interests you and what your takeaways are, what key gaps or conversations you're finding in your professional workspaces or in the environments that you work in. So I encourage you to take advantage of that if that's something that beyond the content that already exists in the fully online program, you get direct interaction with each of the faculty members in the program. So that's in any given time, 5 to 6 experts in their respective field. So with that, we're about wrapping up time here, so I want to be mindful of time. If there was, for Ian and Peter, if there was one key takeaway or something that you would want to make sure that we left our participants today about your topic and space in the mobility credential or in the mobility conversations overall, we'd love to hear from you on that. So with that, Ian, I'm going to pass this along to you first.
I think one takeaway is to get involved. If you're interested in these issues, if you have concerns about the current transportation system in your city or your local area, going to city council meetings, going to transportation planning council meetings, going to county boards, and even looking at what your state representatives are doing is just vital, because all of these issues are going to require regulation and legal changes at times. So if you want better infrastructure for transportation, you want more bike infrastructure, you want e-scooters or bike share or anything of all these different things we talked about, you have the right and the responsibility to advocate for them as a citizen and as a community member. Because for a long time, I think people thought of transportation as and especially in a planning and regulatory state, as just something that happens elsewhere. It happens in a board of elected officials or a board of bureaucrats. And though, to be fair, departments of transportation are trying harder and harder every year to get community insight and community input when they start planning. So like the state of Michigan has a 25 to 40-year plan for transportation, and they have public hearings on that, and I think they're having some virtual ones now, things like that. So if you're interested in these areas, you can go out and have your voice heard, and you can also hear what the lawmakers and regulators think are the problems, and see if those actually match up with the problems you see as someone using a transportation system every day.
Thank you for that. I like the idea of, now more than ever, it's time to be involved, and there's so many sectors that you can get involved in. So thank you for raising awareness on that. Peter, takeaways or thoughts you'd like to conclude with?
Yeah, so I want to come back to my one of the first comments that I made is that that technological innovation as we move towards autonomous and autonomous and connected vehicles and all of that, and multimodality is going to require and does require financial innovation. And so what we're going to see is really more of a move towards what we call digital finance. And we didn't have much to talk about that today, but it's this whole application blockchain in the financing of infrastructure. And basically your car is very likely going to become your own digital wallet, right? So your car is essentially an e-commerce device in the future. And the last thing, we were commenting on that earlier, it actually may be worthwhile to read this agreement that you all agreed to, because actually in the context of digital finance, your car is going to become a revenue generator for you, because you become a prosumer in the future of mobility, as in you're going to get paid for the data that you're contributing in this new data economy. So it's very much worthwhile. It becomes almost call it a job contract, where ultimately you will get some payback. It's still very early in that stage, but your phone, your car are essentially a digital wallet.
Great. Well, Ian and Peter, I really appreciate your conversation and your candid sort of insights into some really important conversations that for some of our participants, they may be familiar with. I think for most, this may be the first time they've considered what things look like in this space. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate this. And for the participants that submitted questions, I hope we got to as many as we could today. And I think with that, we'll conclude. And for those of you that are interested in hearing more about the conversations like what we've talked about today with Ian and Peter, we'll share a little bit. I'll share the slide here about the Foundations of Mobility online certificate. Again, it's being offered by the College of Engineering's unit known as Nexus. The idea is that you have a 100% online course. You can take it at your own pace. You get to hear from a wide cross-section of faculty from across the university and across disciplines, and that you get to hear from various faculty on topics that are related to the mobility space. The course that starts in January is related to systems design, finance, and regulation. And if you're interested in the other topics related to behavior and technology, where we cover equity and access and data and safety, we also cover those topics in the first course of Foundations of Mobility online certificate. So with that, I encourage you to take a look at the website, see what topics interest you, and join us online. And thank you for joining us today. Have a good one.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.